everybody, and welcome to the Difficult Conversations podcast series. Today, we will be talking about faith, God, and the COVID-19 pandemic. There are many reasons why this topic may chime with us during this time. Lockdown offers many people chances for deep philosophical reflection and activities like reading, study, and meditation. And the outbreak has made many of us confront the realities of mortality, death, social justice, the values our society and communities hold, what philosophy or what groups or leaders we should look to for guidance during this dark time, what the future holds, where our lives are going, and even the problem of evil and suffering as the world is held in the grip of an unpredictable and devastating disease outbreak. Many people are looking for guidance and asking fundamental questions about life, death, creation, and the existence of God as we are faced with many facets of existential crisis. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my special theological guests for today's episode on faith, God, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Please welcome Victoria, Nuam, and Liz. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi.
Hey.
Hi.
Hello, thank you. So if you could start off by telling our listeners a little bit about you, what you do, what you're passionate about, and maybe a little bit about your faith and your journey to faith.
I'm Victoria, so I study at the University of Edinburgh doing a PhD in world Christianity. So my interests are in ecumenism, which is basically how Christians connect around the world, and the idea of every single church, because there's lots of splits in the church, working together towards the common goal, which should be one Christian goal. So I guess my faith journey is, so I grew up going to church, but my parents were atheists for a very long time until they lost their first daughter, which kind of brought them back to faith. So like my faith journey has always been very personal and like not pressured by my parents or anything like that. But when I became like a teenager, I did like the typical teenage thing, and I was just like, yeah, church, I don't know, I'm not really too sure about it. And through undergrad, like I studied religion and theology, but like when people ask me, are you a Christian? I'd always be like, yeah, kind of, but I'm more studying it because it's like interesting and I'm interested in lots of religions, etc., etc. But I've got involved with quite a lot of international Christian events, and that really like opened my eyes to so many other young people believe in. That made me think, actually, maybe this is relevant for me, and this is actually something I should look into more. And I've, from those years, very much last year in my master's in Edinburgh, and now in my PhD, I feel very reconnected to faith, and my faith really inspires my PhD research too.
Thanks so much, Victoria. I think that really shows that the faith journey is just not a linear one, and is so personal. So yeah, thanks for that. Liz and Nuam?
So I'm Liz. I'm currently working as a ministry assistant for a kind of an Anglican parish in Nottingham, and what that means basically is that I sort of assist the priests with various things, help in sort of pastoral care, help with some of our work with rough sleepers, perform sort of various roles in services and that kind of thing. And prior to that, I studied also at New College, University of Edinburgh, doing theology, and then did a master's in Amsterdam. And so my focus, I guess, was in sort of systematic theology, and particularly I've kind of focused on questions of like environmental theology and how we can look at social and economic questions theologically. In terms of my journey to faith, I think I've a bit like Victoria, really. I was I was brought up in church. I kind of, I don't really remember ever not going to church, to be perfectly honest. And I think I've always had some kind of personal faith for myself, but that's really changed and shifted over the years. I was raised in kind of, I guess, a fairly evangelical context. And as I've gotten older, I've come to appreciate liturgy and I guess a more kind of open and progressive theology, and so that's where I've kind of landed now.
Hi everyone, my name is Nuam. I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Divinity, University of Edinburgh. Like Victoria, my programme is also World Christianity. For my PhD, I'm specifically looking at Asian feminist theology, but from the perspective of Zomi women in northwest Myanmar. Asian feminist theology is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's Christian women in Asia talking about God, but from their specific Asian context and talking about specific issues pertinent to Asia. But I'm looking at it from the perspective of Zomi women who are an ethnic minority in northwest Myanmar, and I'm interested in finding out what their faith is, what their practices are, what their beliefs are, in a context that's marked by mass poverty and inequality and a patriarchal system. So I'm interested in finding out how life in this context has shaped their beliefs and their practices and their spirituality. As for my faith journey, I think like most people here, I was brought up in a Christian household. Both my parents are Baptist ministers. And I've kind of always grown up having a faith and having some kind of relationship with God. Even during the darkest, quite a dark, difficult period of my teenage years, I still would say I had a relationship with God, even though that relationship was marked by one of anger and hate. I nonetheless still believed in him. And, you know, I've recovered from that, and I think it was like, after a few years after I recovered from that, I still would say I had belief in him, but I wasn't really kind of strong. But it wasn't until my master's, also here at Edinburgh, that I kind of started to kind of grow a bit more stronger in my faith and started to pray more and to kind of be more interested in what my faith means to me and exploring that. So I think what I would say now is that I'm a Christian, and I think I would align with quite a progressive branch of Christianity. I'm sure most of my friends kind of wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that. But I'm still very open to asking questions, to exploring my faith. And something that I've learned doing theology as a discipline is that there's just so many complex nuances to faith and to spirituality that I just don't know, that it's hard to that I kind of find it very worrying when people are quite dogmatic about certain stances, because at the end of the day, at least my belief is, we're just humans trying to know a transcendental being, and there is no physical way in which we can ever know an answer with 100% certainty, especially about something as large and as unknowable as God. So I guess that's where I am now. Definitely would say I'm a Christian, definitely would say I am on the progressive, quote marks, end of Christianity, even though that has its own flaws and issues itself. But always open to exploring, always open to asking questions.
Well, we're just so lucky to have such a mixture of perspectives and expertise here on the podcast today. So thank you so much, all three of you, for joining. So we're going to deep dive into our discussion on faith, God and COVID-19. And I'd like you to answer the question, where do you find and see God in times of personal and global crisis, such as COVID-19? I think this question resonates with people of all faiths, and agnostic and atheist people. You know, where do you find guidance and hope during these times, whether that takes the form of God or not? I think we can all relate to this question. So who would like to kick us off there?
So for me, the question, like, where do you find and see God? Like, I've got a really strong incarnational theology, which means that, like, a lot of what I believe is based on the person of Jesus, and the teachings of him, like, and what he did when he was down alongside us. So for me, like, you know, I know, like, the really corny wristbands that people used to wear when we were teenagers that said, like, what would Jesus do? Actually, for me, that's really important and that's really relevant. So the common lectionary for last week was from John chapter 14. And I usually absolutely hate this passage because in it has the only way to the Father is through me. I am the way, the truth, and the life, which a lot of Christians like to take as being only by believing in Jesus can you go to heaven and can you be redeemed. But I actually really enjoy other parts of this passage. So for instance, it says, like, my Father's house has many rooms. Like, it includes the diversity of people, like God is alongside so many people in our world. And also it says, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these. So like the idea that like people who are Christians and like God is like everywhere. So where would Jesus be if he was here right now? I think he would be in the hospitals, he'd be in the supermarkets, he'd be sitting at home with the lonely old people. Like, and actually, where is God? God is everywhere. God's like struggling alongside us. Like where Jesus came down, Jesus, like I don't see like why Jesus came when he came. He could be here right now. Like that. That's where I see God.
What you've just said, Victoria, really resonates with my understanding of Jesus. I think for me, I see Jesus and God in the nurses and care workers who we are sending to the front line of the fight against COVID without adequate protection, without adequate PPE, without adequate facilities and medical equipment. I see Jesus in the delivery drivers who are being forced to work, who are being prevented from unionizing. I see Jesus in the elderly and the infirm who are lonely and even more isolated than ever. I see Jesus in the homeless who can't isolate, who don't have a place to go to be safe from the risk of infection. I see Jesus in the most vulnerable and marginalised in society. One of my favourite quotes in the Bible is where Jesus says, "Whatsoever you do to the least of my brothers, you do unto me. You clothed me. If you clothed someone who was unclothed, if you helped someone in jail, if you fed someone who was hungry, you are feeding and clothing and helping me." And I think another thing I would say is, to answer the question of where do I find and seek God in times of personal and global crisis, I think something that I've been kind of finding a lot of strength in is the idea that as a Christian, I believe that God is sovereign, and Christians can debate amongst themselves how much sovereignty they believe that God has over the universe. But I personally believe that God is in control, and I believe that God is sovereign over the situation, over this pandemic, over this world, over my life, and I think that has given me quite a huge sense of peace. In such a scary time. I think not everyone will relate to this, but I think I personally, I'm finding it quite helpful to kind of just remember that, like, at least in my personal belief, God's in control. God knows what's going to happen, and God will, and the God that I believe in will work things out for the best, even though it looks hopeless and bleak right now.
I've definitely found something quite similar. I think it's quite hard in a way to see God in the big picture at the moment, but I really do see God in the small things, in the care that people are showing for one another, people coming alongside their neighbours, the doctors and the nurses and the hospital porters showing up every day, and they're in some ways the kind of the saints of today's Britain, and they're the people sort of showing us where God is. And I think that in times like this, in order to really see God, you have to kind of not look in the sort of grand overarching narrative so much as just seeing God in the face of all of those people around you.
I think that everything that you've just said proves interesting, not just for fellow Christians, but also for non-Christians, which we will have listening to this podcast. We will have a diversity of people, and perhaps my view is that I don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God, or that's currently the perspective that I hold in my life, although that has fluctuated at different points. I also grew up with Christian influences from one side of the family and went to a Christian primary school, but so I was a strong believer in Jesus being the Son of God when I was in my early years, and now at least at this point in my life, I believe that that Jesus was a radical revolutionary. I always think of when Jesus turned over the tables in the temple in kind of disgust at the kind of capitalist greed, or that's at least my interpretation of that act. And so his actions there really evoke my reactions to the capitalist agenda, more widely, but also throughout the governmental responses to COVID-19 to get everybody back to work and putting economy first. And I think of all of the things that Jesus has to teach us, and that, how we can think about and integrate Jesus's teachings into our responses to governmental policy. So moving on to the next question. this is on the problem of evil and suffering, which really is a kind of major driver for, I think it's fair to say, lots of people's agnostic or atheist perspectives. So my question is, lots of people see the problem of evil as a key reason for why God does not exist. How can we reconcile this with pandemics and with disease outbreak and with the kind of horrors that we see in the world and with COVID-19 specifically? Sorry, I know that's a complex and really difficult question, but do you have anything to say on that?
Unfortunately, this is something that theologians have been arguing about since the beginning. So I don't think we're not going to fix it today. But like I think for us three anyway, the kind of church position that we come from, we can only really understand the problem of evil through the actions of Jesus. So like I don't think about God like independently from also the role of the Jesus and the Holy Spirit. So like the idea of God being like invincible up in heaven, directing people, completely powerful, that really doesn't work with me and like how I understand my religion. So for me, like the problem of evil is like God's like grace, like he is like abstained from the world in a sense. Like God's not directing our every move to enable us to have free will and enable us to be like agents of our own life. And that's like a really generous thing that God has done. Like he can see him as like a loving father, like we're his children, and like as like parents will like have to at some point let their children make mistakes, and put them into a dangerous and scary world when really they probably just want to tuck them up in bed in cotton wool. God's also had to do that with us, and he had to do it with Jesus too. So again, kind of like on the, as I was saying before, the idea of like Jesus walking alongside us, like how I understand Jesus. My favorite quote came from a woman called Marcela Altius-Reed. She was an Argentinian feminist theologian, and she said the way that we need to understand Jesus is he is like a poor, he's a prostitute's child in a public toilet, and like that was the most radical thing I think anyone had said at that time. So then how we understand the problem of evil, like, well, the problem of evil exists, but God doesn't want evil. God like sacrificed himself to help us deal with evil. Like we can understand evil through Jesus and how Jesus like dealt with it in that sense.
I think, thank you for that. Like that's really helpful. I think as well, like for me, this is a question that I've been thinking about quite a lot actually over the last few months. And I really understand the temptation to sort of ask, how can God exist when there's so much suffering in the world? But in some ways, and certainly in the way that it's kind of been dealt with in the theological tradition, it becomes this kind of philosophical question about what's actually like a really deep and personal problem. I know that when I've asked this question in the past, it's not really been that sort of philosophical answer that I've been seeking. And so I think, like Victoria says, it's kind of helpful to shift the question in a little way. In a way, it's not really about the why, but it's about where we can find God in all of this. And I know that that's not. I mean, I'm not setting out to convince anyone particularly who doesn't already believe in God. But I think for me as a Christian, like, I'm trying to reframe this question now in terms of, well, how can I show up for others in the face of, this kind of terrible suffering? How can I be someone that God is working through for others? How can I show that solidarity? And how do we provide the space for people to, lament the suffering that they experience, but also for that suffering to be kind of redeemed and transformed in Christ? And I think for me that's a more helpful way of looking at it rather than just focusing on the why.
I think that's such a good point that you made there, Liz, because I think sometimes there's a tendency as Christians or as churches or as religious institutions to kind of act like we have all the answers. And I think especially in a time of crisis like this, we have to be quite careful to be like, to not be like, no, this is definitely why this is happening. This is why you're suffering and they're not, et cetera, because then, we don't know. We don't know. As Christians, we acknowledge that we are not God and that we are human, which kind of like brings kind of brings me back to my whole wariness of systematic theology as a whole, because it's kind of, for me, it's just like a bunch of people sitting around thinking, what is God like? And, but no one actually knows. So why are we all here? And I think that's why I find it so helpful, like you're saying, Liz, to kind of shift the question a little bit to not, why is there suffering in the world? Because I don't know, and I don't think we will ever get a satisfactory answer. But what we can ask instead is, what can I do about suffering in the world? What can I do to relieve that suffering? What can I do to relieve injustice? What can I do to present light and hope to other people around me, Christians or not Christians?
I completely agree. I think sometimes the why can be a bit of a distraction, and it can be so kind of abstracted from like the
real life,
the messiness and exactly. I think that the greatest challenge of the Christian journey is to like learn to inhabit the reality of those contradictions.
Mm-hmm.
God exists and there is suffering, and I don't think we'll ever quite know how those two truths fit together, but they do, and we have to kind of move forward with that and work out what to do about it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like it's also kind of like amazing to be able to be in that tension, like in the same that like we don't understand like the problem of evil, we don't understand like how God can be both God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and like I don't understand how like I can be a helpful person in COVID without actually being able to physically help anybody, but also like there are things that I can do, and like I think always living in that tension. As a Christian, we have the most perfect example of the tension in the Trinity. And that's really comforting, I think, that like we're not meant to know, and living in this kind of like mystery, but still being supported by it. That's like the ultimate faith, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a really profound way of putting it, Victoria. That's everything that you've all just said has really added a new angle to my thinking about this question. And I'm so sorry if you're absolutely sick of being asked this question, because, for example, as a feminist, I'm always asked the question, how can we say that women are subordinated and men aren't, and we live in a gender unequal society? And I'm like, God, it's so obvious and it's so complex, and I get kind of bored with being asked some of these really fundamental questions. I want to move my thinking and my philosophizing and my work beyond those fundamental questions, and not be occupied with things that you can't solve. And I also believe, and sorry, by the way, if my theology is a little bit immature in comparison to you three, because I haven't studied religion, and
I'm sure there are people out there who are listening who think our theology is immature, so
yeah, exactly.
There's always a more mature theology.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think that's the whole point, isn't it, of hosting a podcast, is making these conversations accessible and getting everybody at the table. I think everybody's welcome at the table to discuss these issues. I do think that there are certain questions that in their very nature, because they belong to, I don't know, a transcendental realm and involve transcendental matters, they are inherently beyond our comprehension. So I guess that's a very unhelpful but consistent conclusion that I always come to when I'm faced with such questions. I guess the only kind of major barrier that I still have to feeling content with the problem of evil and suffering is I understand what you were saying, Victoria, about free will and God allowing his children to have free will, almost like a tough love approach, right? But something that I struggle with is phenomena like pandemics and sickness can't necessarily be related to free will. Maybe our responses to them can be absolutely related to free will. But why is it that such devastating forces exist beyond our control? But again, that may be presenting the exact problem that I've just said that I want to push from, which is that, these are transcendental matters, perhaps. I don't know if that makes sense or whether that's just a ramble. So my next question to you all is, are there any instances or stories of healing and sickness in the Bible that resonate with you or that you would like to speak about today? So maybe we'll focus a bit on scripture now and biblical stories. So who would like to kick us off with that question?
I think I could maybe connect that answer with your problem that you just said, Poppy, actually, that, we don't understand, like we can't connect free will with the idea of God, enabling his children to have free will with the idea that, I'm rambling, like the idea that God said, God's giving us free will, but then there's evil and suffering that doesn't come from human hands. Like, how do we connect global pandemics with that? And I mean, healing and sickness in the Bible, the story that always catches me is Luke 8:43-48, which is about a woman who was probably suffering from menstrual bleeding, really, really heavy menstrual bleeding. And Jesus was preaching in a crowd, and she went through the crowd and she touched Jesus's cloak because she just believed, and she just knew that he would heal her. And she broke all the social boundaries by doing that. Like, she was a poor woman, and Jesus lost it, and he was like, "Who touched me? Who did that?" And everyone was like, "Oh my gosh, Jesus has got mad, like, what's going on?" And he said, "Because you believe, like, your faith has healed you." And actually, like, some interpretations have said that, like, actually Jesus stopping her menstrual bleeding got rid of that divide between her being that impure woman who wasn't accepted in society to being just someone among everyone else. So in that sense, like, the healing that Jesus brought was for a purpose. The reason she had the really bad bleeding and she was like, and she wasn't included in society, we don't know. But the way that Jesus dealt with the problem is a good example for Christians and how we should deal with problems. Like, in that sense, that he broke down those social barriers. He brought a good that came from a wrong, from a disaster. And maybe when we look at COVID, we can think about that. Like, when we're rebuilding society after this, we don't want to go back to our capitalistic sort of horrible, evil society. We can think of ways to be more sustainable, be more of a community, and follow Jesus in the way that we heal after these things.
The stories of healing that resonate for me kind of match quite well with what you've just said, Victoria, because for me, something that I've kind of found really powerful about the stories of Jesus healing and doing miracles in the Bible is, as you said, it's not just the physical healing that takes place, but it's also the social healing. So with the example that you gave of the hemorrhaging woman, not only was she healed physically of her condition, but because Jesus got rid of that social taboo, she could now enter society again. She could now be accepted by community again. And I think that's something that I've always found really powerful, is that it's twofold. It's not only the healing of whatever physical or mental ailments that you might have, but it's also a communal healing, that you're being brought back into society, you're being brought back into communion with people around you, you're being welcomed again at tables, that people are now treating you as the valued member of society that you are, that previous social taboos or your illness made you that would have excluded you from. And I think that's something that is so powerful and so important to keep in mind when we're talking about healing. That is not just physical healing that's important, but it's also healing old wounds and hurts and bitterness and bringing back. And it is a more holistic approach to healing that I think is always important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's really, really helpful and really important. It's easy to focus on that physical stuff, but actually sometimes that's almost in some ways, the least important part of the story. The story that I was thinking of, I guess, in preparation for this podcast was the story of the healing of the paralyzed man. So it's in Luke, and I think it's in the other synoptic gospels also, I think. But essentially, Jesus is preaching in this really crowded house, and it's so crowded that you can't even kind of get up to it. And there are a group of friends, I guess, carrying this man who's paralyzed. And the house is so crowded that they can't get in the door. And what they do is take him up onto the roof and like lower him through the ceiling. And Jesus, I mean, he forgives their sins and offers forgiveness also to the paralyzed man and then heals him. But he also challenges the kind of religious leaders who say you have no authority to forgive sins. These religious leaders, the Pharisees, they were kind of powerful and well regarded, but also really focused on sort of following the religious laws to the letter. And so what Jesus did in healing, and then also in kind of offering the forgiveness and the spiritual healing to this group of people, was really in defiance of kind of the religious authorities of the day. And I think that the healing that God offers can quite often be not only kind of physical and spiritual, but in that it's quite subversive. It's not just for kind of the wealthy or the powerful or the people that we sort of put at the top of the society. It's also for the marginalized and the vulnerable, and really kind of goes against all of the rules. And I think it's a call to Christians to act in sort of radical solidarity with the most marginalized in society.
That's really interesting what you've just said, Liz, because it reminds me of one of my favourite stories of healing in the Bible, which takes place in Luke chapter 13, where Jesus heals a woman who is bent over and cannot stand straight. But he does it on the Sabbath, and that draws criticism from the synagogue leaders, quite understandably, who says, why have you done this on a Sabbath? It's meant to be a day of rest and respect towards God. But the point of the story is that Jesus reminds them that yes, the Sabbath day is meant to be holy, but an act of compassion such as healing someone is also holy in and of itself. And I think that's I've always found that to be such a powerful reminder that we need to be careful not to kind of try and follow the rules and regulations to the extent where we lose sight of the person in need. And I think it is always going to be a godly and holy thing to help a person in need. And I think that's something that I've always kind of found a really powerful reminder of what, for me, is at the heart of Christian witness and Christian discipleship, which is showing the love of Jesus and God, whom I believe in, to other people, even if it means going against certain rules and regulations of society, or kind of ignoring what people might think of you. Like that, an act of mercy, an act of compassion, an act of friendship, an act of help is always going to be holy in the sight of God.
Yeah, that kind of, if you don't mind, kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about how I, in my eyes, see Jesus as a radical socialist, as a radical feminist, as a radical revolutionary in many ways. And if we were to follow his teachings, I think we would be, living quite unusual and radical lives, not just around inclusion of poor people, but also the homeless, the sick, women, as you've already mentioned, and also sex workers. There are, I think, numerous mentions of Jesus kind of opening up his following and showing compassion to women who are thought to have been prostitutes in the Bible. I'm always so interested in how, as a feminist, we can reconcile religion and feminism. And I think listeners really kind of, if you get some time, do look up feminist approaches to not just Christianity, but all religions. There's some really fascinating interpretations, and it's so underrepresented in theological and philosophical work, these feminist reconceptions of mainstream understandings of theology and scripture. So my next question to you all is, maybe we're kind of steering around to the institutional side of things. So how do you think the church has reacted to the COVID-19 crisis?
I'll talk from very much the kind of level of individual churches rather than the church as an institution. But I think essentially church doors closed, and the life of the congregation, and I know to a certain extent the sort of wider community that church serves, is so often very centred around the building. So, in our church in Nottingham, we're open 7 days a week. People come in and out just to pray and to reflect. We've got, services on Sunday, but also various sort of services, in the middle of the week. And so, when doors close and you kind of can't come together for all of those services and the activities and, the various sort of drop-ins and stuff that we host, there's there was really a need for like a very rapid and like radical kind of reconfiguring of what we do and what we offer. And so, in terms of like service and stuff, so many churches have kind of moved online, and in various formats. There's kind of live streams, we're doing webcasts, other people are sort of putting out, pre-produced videos and that kind of thing. And I think the aim really has been to kind of offer, help people stay connected with worship, and with, that part of the life of the church. And then the other side has been to work out how to kind of offer pastoral support and practical support to members of the congregations and communities, in a way that meets people's needs and is also kind of safe from a social distancing perspective. And so, I mean, it's been a really busy time for churches and for church leaders trying to sort of do all of that. And I think we'll talk about it a bit more in a minute, but some really interesting things I think have come from all of that.
Mm-hmm. Like for me, like I find it hard not to like say that overall I think the church has failed in the sense that in reaction to COVID, the church wasn't the first to close its doors to protect people. Yeah. When I think it should have been. Like South Korea, for instance, the virus predominantly spread there because of a mass church gathering where someone went and had the virus and spread it to so many people. We could have learned from that and closed our doors here, but we decided that actually the church building was so important. And now I think that we've realised it's not. And I know so I mostly affiliate with the United Reformed Church, and I know that they've done so well in trying to create like communities. So like my church here in Edinburgh, I've had emails from different people in the congregation like checking I was okay. It's amazing that I can worship with my home church in Cardiff. So every Sunday, like I'm worshipping with my family and the people that I grew up with, but then I'm also I can worship with my Edinburgh church. It is amazing. And a lot of young people who I'm friends with in the United Reformed Church, we're also doing our own church services, and they're all at different times on a Sunday. So I'm both overwhelmed with church, but also like it's incredible to be able to connect with so many people in this way. And for me, like something that's really stuck with me as really nourishing during this time was Dietrich Bonhoeffer when he created the Confessing Church when it was Nazi Germany. When he was in jail, he wrote to his parents on, I think it was Pentecost Sunday, and he said like, although I'm taking the communion on my own, I'm worshipping on my own, it's imaginary. I know that the whole community is with me and they are doing this at the same time, and actually I'm never alone in Christ. And I like just those kinds of things just really, really are important right now. And like, I'm a very strict nonconformist, but like the image of the Pope when he was walking and doing the rites in the Vatican all by himself, with like it completely bare and empty, that like really struck me. Just like, wow, the dedication of that man towards his Christian community, that hits me too. And like, it kind of reminds me like when we're walking around Edinburgh now, it's empty. Like this is a theme park of a city. Like it doesn't work. Like, and I'm just like the same with the church. Like we have empty church buildings everywhere, but people are still worshipping, and it's just like being forced to strip back. Really, is also kind of like liberating, and it's empowering for Christians that we are still Christians, and we're still able to be Christians right now. It's really amazing.
I was going to say, it definitely also kind of highlights some aspects of the Christian faith that I hadn't really considered much before. Like, for example, communion and the kind of obviously I kind of understood the sacramental power of communion and remembrance and Jesus' death on the cross and resurrection, but it's also, like you were just saying in the quote from Deirdre Bonhoeffer, like it's also an act of communion. Like I'm taking it in communion with other brothers and sisters and other people in the body of Christ as an act of not only remembrance but also of fellowship and of partaking in the same meal and the same act together, which really kind of unifies and brings people together in a way that at a time when we can't actually be together physically. I thought that was, it's taken on a whole new meaning for me.
It's really interesting how different people have experienced that aspect of it specifically, like the communion aspect. So I don't know what your kind of I don't know if what sort of denomination or tradition you're involved with, but like, I mean, I know as an Anglican there are.
I don't know either, Liz. So.
Oh, that's cool. Okay, I just didn't want to like assume anything.
I'm floating.
Cool. But like for lots of Anglicans, I guess there's kind of quite a strong belief that really the communion needs to be sort of consecrated and so on, blessed by a priest. And I'm still working out exactly how I kind of understand that and think about all of that. But I've not been able to take communion, and I haven't done since we locked down. And I know that that's true for many, many other Anglicans, with lots of Catholics, especially. And I think that's really painful because, as you say, it's not just a kind of personal act of remembrance. It's that thing that would kind of bring us all together when we're apart is something that we can't do because of the sort of physical limitations of the sacrament, I guess.
It kind of like forces you to think about what's really important to your theology and to your faith, doesn't it? In ways that I hadn't considered. Like, I mean, I knew I liked the kind of the communal worship aspect of it, but I didn't think I would miss it as much as I do now. Like, it's one thing to tune in, and it's great being able to like tune into a church live stream from like in my pajamas, but it's like there is a difference between singing corporately as a body of Christ in a building and singing, Amazing Grace on your own at like 10 a.m.
Yeah.
I think as well, it's been I think for lots of young people, it's I mean, it's been difficult, but it's still okay. But in lots of churches, many of the congregation are older, and not all of them will have internet access and those kinds of things. And when all of the kind of all of the offerings of worship are delivered over the internet, it can be really hard for some people to sort of stay connected to their church communities in that way. And that's it's quite hard to know how to overcome those limitations. I mean, you can stay in contact by phone and, letter and all those kinds of things. But in terms of kind of worship offerings, it's quite hard to know how to overcome that. But it's certainly something that I think there's a bit of a gap in still.
So it sounds like there's kind of a hybrid of equally and mutually existing, like painful, but also at the same time like advantageous and new elements to worship under COVID conditions. And one of the kind of reoccurring themes in the podcast series is how many of the guests, regardless of what topic we're talking about that day, have seen the pandemic and the lockdown policies as an opportunity to exercise the imagination and to think about, okay, well, how could this actually reconceptualize our work and the way that we do things, and what new possibilities can this provide? And I think that there are many things for churches to learn that are both kind of depressing and exciting from the pandemic. So a follow-on question to the one I asked about how the church has reacted to COVID-19, I'd like to maybe bring in a feminist lens and some elements of intersectional feminism and ask, how do you think the church's reaction has been gendered? And how does maybe that question evoke further questions around marginalisation and what the church adaptations to COVID-19 have said about reach and inclusion and exclusion. Something that I've been thinking about is how this digitisation of church has included many groups of people that it never did before, and also it's coming up on people's feeds that it may have not done before, but also it's excluding many people. So for example, the very poor who may not own technological devices, and the technically illiterate, such as, I've got family members that really struggle with using the computer and accessing their weekly church, their worship sessions. So over to you all. So how do you think this reaction is gendered, and how can we apply maybe an intersectional lens to their reactions?
Maybe we can start with the positives, Poppy. How, like you were saying, that church services are just like popping up on people's social media and stuff. TFN did a survey which said just under a quarter of adults in the UK have tuned in to a worship service of some kind, whether that's broadcasted by the BBC or like an independent church. And that's just like such an amazing thing that, like, in this crisis, like, Britain is reconnecting with religion. But the most amazing thing for me, like, my research is looking at young people, but 34% of young adults did that, and 5% of those young adults had never been to a church service before. And that's just an incredible statistic, that like we're reaching people now who have never seen the need for church before. And as I said earlier, like, I worship with a group of young people from my denomination. We've got one girl who is a nurse in a COVID ward, and she joins us when she can for worship. And she said this is the most like consistent she's been able to worship than ever before, because we can like tailor our services around when she's working and when she's not. And like she really is the one that absolutely needs that fellowship, and she needs that service. So like, it's amazing that the flexibility that this has given, we can reach people in that way.
I think what you've said is really highlighted, and I think we've sort of touched on it already, but I'm not disabled myself, but I've seen sort of people talking about it on Twitter, and I've heard accounts of it from kind of people that I work with in my parish, saying that people who just kind of couldn't physically access church buildings now have access to the worship in a way that they never did before, because it's kind of online. It can, you can get it from your own home. You can often get it at a time that's kind of convenient or suitable for you. And I think that's a really positive thing. And I think we're learning to kind of relocate church from like being just in the building to being church as something that happens among people, whether or not they can be physically gathered. And I hope that we can kind of, as things slowly open up over the summer, we might be able to, I don't think we're going to be able to go back and worship in buildings anytime soon, but, in a few months' time, perhaps, that we can kind of continue to think carefully about what we mean by kind of sacred space, and whether or not that has, whether that can be something that isn't always physical, in order that it can be accessible to a greater number of people than it might otherwise be.
Like, I mean, you raised very good points earlier, Poppy, when you were asking your question about how, it's great that church is now online, so we can reach wider audiences and more people are interested than ever before. But it does raise questions about access, and who has technology and who has the money to access online recordings and online live streams and stuff like that. But then also who has the time, because there are if you're say you're a single mom and you have 3 kids, like that 2 hours on a Sunday morning where you can take your kids to church in a safe place where they will be looked after, they will be provided for, they will be entertained. That 2 hours could be such a big reprieve for you, but unfortunately you no longer have access to that. And we're seeing a lot of discussions online and on social media about how difficult it is to work from home when you've got caring duties, and for a lot of people, church was also a space away from home where they could also feel welcome, and they could also feel loved and see community. For some people, home is not a happy place, and having that kind of outreach and that kind of that kind of contact, outside contact, was really beneficial for them. But unfortunately, they no longer get that because of lockdown restrictions and stuff. So I think, yeah, there's definitely a gendered aspect, like, especially because if we bear in mind that a lot of caring responsibilities still fall on women in the society. So yes, okay, more people can access church, but then how many people can actually sit down for 2 hours and listen to a service online, while also caring for, 3 children under the age of 7 or something like that,
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, Nuam, that the home is not a neutral space for many people, especially women. And one thing that I think is really interesting, if I may, is that I find that there are really cutting edge aspects to the adaptations that churches have made to the pandemic, particularly around the digitization of church and worship. But then there are also some really old, archaic aspects that remain, and those things seem to be coexisting at the moment. These really exciting new and cutting edge and modern and contemporary parts, and then also the continuation of old orders. So I don't know whether any of you have seen this, but I've observed that many of the women in terms of the online church services are still doing many of the kind of secretarial, administrative, and support roles, rather than necessarily being on in the kind of center stage of the production, if you like, whether that's preaching or being the ones that are majority on camera. I don't know whether you've noticed that, and of course that will vary according to denomination. And if you tune into a group of young people in the States that are doing some sort of living room guitar worship, that will be a very different scene from if you're looking at a traditional Sunday worship in, I don't know, certain more orthodox denominations. So yeah, that's just something that I've observed, and that I'd perhaps say in relation to this question, that I think that there are many things that are new and contemporary, and really do resist the old ways of the church. But then there are also certain parts of it that persist, certain traditional aspects that persist. But I would say that is the same for all workplaces and all sectors and industries and areas of work in some way, that there's this sharp gender segregation in many aspects of the world and the labour market. So it's not something that is bespoke to the church.
I mean, the church certainly has a lot of problems with gender equality, and I mean even where in many denominations now, most denominations probably, women can be ordained, but often that kind of lags behind the number of men that are being ordained, and all those kinds of things. And certainly, I mean, the pandemic has not solved any of the kind of underlying structural issues at all. It hasn't made them better. I think essentially what we've done is kind of carried a lot of that over into, the pre-existing problems over into some sort of online format.
But hopefully, I think seeing these problems in a different way might highlight that they are wrong.
Yeah, I hope so. Fingers crossed.
We'll pray about it.
I think what's been challenging really, and what was challenging at the beginning was because especially here, right? So we locked down in the approach to Easter, and it was just kind of it was pretty frantic, really, trying to make the switch and then just deal with all of the kind of practicalities of offering some sort of kind of Easter pattern of worship, which traditionally is quite a lot of sort of different services and elements and so on. And I hope that now, but also going forwards, that we begin to reflect a bit on what's gone on, and kind of, and I think it probably has already been happening in some places, but just think theologically about what this means about space, how we can kind of move forwards and build a better world and build a better church. I don't want to say on the other side because we're nowhere near the other side, but as we go forward into the future, let's say.
Yeah, so much to think about there. I think that's a really important point you made there, Liz, that even though in many denominations women can get ordained, that doesn't necessarily translate into an equal makeup because of all of the kind of social and political and economic forces that shape things like applying and promotion and recognition and institutional cultures within teams that also shape the gender makeup. It's not just a question of like opening the door for women and then women will walk through it. It's not as simple as that. It's a far more kind of complex economic and political scenario than that. I guess for me, my answer to this question about like accessibility and marginalization comes to, and what I think really is the kind of, I don't know, epicenter of intersectional thinking. I mean, yeah, obviously intersectionality talks about race and class and age and gender and how those things intersect and form our experience of the world and our access to certain spheres. I think it really comes down to a philosophy that there are many ways of doing things and there are many ways of being and existing and experiencing certain things. And for me, an intersectional perspective is resisting the idea that there's like this, there's a pinnacle way of doing something and of being, and this kind of orthodoxy or a dogmatic idea of how, for example, church should run, or how education should run, or how the workplace should run, or how you should live your life. I think that there should be a spectrum there, and that's and a recognition of that spectrum. So moving on to our next question. So we're going to be opening up the discussion to a global perspective to kind of actively push back on the Eurocentrism that we see so much and the Western-centric perspectives that we see so much in all forms of scholarship and research and academic work, and that still, you know, is really pertinent in theology and philosophy and religious studies and so on. So my question to you is, what about Christians around the world? What are they doing right now? What responses are we seeing in other parts of the world? So who would like to kick us off with that question?
As a PhD researcher in Myanmar I was there from about like January 2020 to mid-March 2020. So just as the kind of outbreak was spreading. So I'm there doing research on Asian feminist theology, looking at Zomi women in the northwest of Myanmar and their kind of faith and beliefs. And it was a really interesting time to be there when all of this was kicking off, because I kind of got to see firsthand what their theology of healing and their theology of health looked like. And what I was noticing, and I'd love to chase this up when I can go back into fieldwork, was a lot of kind of idea around the blood of Jesus as protecting them from the illness, and like the use of communion, not only as a symbol of remembering Jesus' death and sacrifice and resurrection, but also as an act of protection, almost as kind of like, I don't want to say the blood of Jesus as a talisman, but similar to the idea that like as a Christian we believe in the power of Jesus' blood. And therefore that kind of sets us apart, or that kind of protects me from people who might not share those beliefs. And something else that I kind of also saw was this, like lots of prayers for protection, obviously, prayers for healing and for safety. Psalm 91 was a very popular psalm. For those of you who are unfamiliar, it's basically a psalm of protection, talking about how God is a fortress and a rock and safety, and even though 10,000 may fall beside me, I will still be upright because I believe in God as my protector. So that was kind of popular motif that was was very popular among Christians around that time. And if that sounds strange to us in the West, I think it's important to remember the context of Myanmar, which is one of the poorest nations in the world, and it's recovering from like decades of military oppression, and it's like economic stagnation, and it's got a very weak healthcare system, a lack of facilities, a lack of education, and like the remoteness of the region where I was in. Those factors have all contributed to this idea of God primarily as a healer and as a protector, which I don't think we would necessarily see in the West. I feel like Christian responses that I'm seeing have been more about I don't know. I mean, it's not fair to say that they haven't been looking to God as a healer or protector, but I think in comparison to the Christians that I was around in Myanmar, I think there was definitely a stronger emphasis in Myanmar about this idea of like only God can heal us and only God can save us, because we can't trust, we don't have access to medicine, we don't have access to ventilators, we don't have access to sanitation or health and hygiene, or proper health and hygiene. So the only thing we have left is God and Jesus. So I think there was, like, for me, there was definitely a greater emphasis on this idea of God as protector and healer than there might not necessarily be in the West.
That's amazing to hear, Nuam. Thank you. I think, like, for me, I've been struggling to see how Christians around the world have like polarized each other. So if you think of like the Christian community as an international community, the idea that like there should be like ecumenism working, like Christians should be working together. Actually, like, I don't know, like I feel like just generally as well, like there's been a lot of like British nationalism coming out of this. Like, while the rest of Europe, their economic systems can die, but we're British, so we can go back to work. And I hate it so much, and you can see it mirrored as well in Christianity, like sort of like more Pentecostal styles, especially you can see in like Brazil. And I think Mexico as well at the moment, their prime minister or president is Pentecostal, and they sort of sit there trying to say that, like, we need the church open, we need to go back to work, God will protect us, we don't need healthcare systems, etc., etc. As Nuam was saying in Myanmar, like, actually our understanding, we need to be sensitive to that and understand like where it's coming from and understand their reasons for that. And like, it's not our job to attack people because they have a really strong faith in God as a healer. Like, that's amazing, and that's something that we can't comprehend because we've been stripped of that in a way. Like, so I think there's a need, I think, for Christians to kind of lead. I don't want to say like lead the way, but like be more obvious in how we approach other ways of being. Of reacting to this crisis right now around the world and internationally, and like, instead of polarizing each other, trying to protect ourselves, actually like see ourselves holding hands with everyone else who is dealing with the same problem but maybe in different ways, and seeking ways that we can learn from each other. Like in Asia, like Singapore, Taiwan, like the way the church has responded, the way people have responded, the virus rate has gone down so much because people have been obedient, people have been doing this app, people have like upholded the community rather than their own personal agency. And then you see in the States, you see like, oh well, it's my right to get a haircut over it while 94-year-old Nancy can look after herself. Like, just different ways of understanding and different appreciations. I think the Christians need to do a bit more as an international group, is to value each other.
And what about when it comes to other religions around the world? Just a kind of quick question before we move on to our final fire round question of the podcast. Have you appreciated the responses that you've seen from other religions? I always find it really interesting how religious people, believers, can reconcile their own faith and convictions, strong convictions about their own faith and the ways that people should believe, with also appreciating other faiths and other philosophies. I find that so fascinating.
Did you guys see the Christian responses to BBC4 changing or putting the Islamic prayers on for Ramadan?
No, what was that about?
It was horrible. Like, so many Christians were so adamant against it, and they were just like, the BBC should no longer be a British institution, we're a Christian nation. It was really, really horrible.
That's horrid.
Yeah, and I couldn't believe it. It made me really, really angry. Because like the post after that on my Twitter feed, we all know what my Twitter feed looks like now, was talking about Sikhs, because Sikhs are so amazing and so generous.
I was just going to mention them.
Yeah, and they've been giving out so much food and going to hospitals and stuff like that. And that was my next post. It just made me so angry about how religions can approach each other. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, I don't know much. Like, I've not looked into it much, but I'd really love to know how like Muslims are coping with Ramadan right now. Because it's some really.
Oh well, maybe that's another podcast idea. Yeah, I would love to.
Yeah, I feel like that.
Yeah, I would love to continue the theme of looking at faith and COVID more. So and maybe that would be the focus would be more on like ritual. I think that would be fascinating, adapting ritual to the home, which obviously we've touched on a few points during this discussion. But this could be a whole nother podcast talking about what I said a few moments ago, how we can appreciate the actions of other religions whilst also distancing ourselves from certain aspects of their belief and reconciling your strong faith in, say, Christianity, and also appreciating other religions. I just find it so fascinating, and I would love to do a whole other podcast on it.
Victoria.
What were you going to say?
Oh yeah, I was going to say, Victoria, did you see the thing about in Canada there were cases of some Sikh doctors who were shaving their beards in order to prevent.
Wow.
So I mean. Yeah, obviously in the Sikh religion, the hair is sacred and you're not meant to cut it. But these doctors, I think in Canada, I haven't actually fully read into the news story, were shaving their beards because they didn't want to risk transmitting the virus that way, because they were doctors and they were treating COVID patients. And I thought that was just like such a beautiful and poignant example of what I think a lot of religions are at the heart of them, which is care for other people, whether that's driven by a set of principles that you follow day to day, or whether that's by a belief in a transcendental being, or whatever it is. Like, I feel like, at least in the Sikh religion and in Christianity, there is a concern for other people, and that will always triumph any religious regulations or laws. And that was kind of what the point was of that scripture that I kind of mentioned of the healing of the woman on the Sabbath, was about the idea that like we need to look at like, what is the purpose of my faith? Is it to help other people, or is it so I can look good by following a set of rules?
God, that story actually makes me a bit like emotional. That's amazing to
Yeah,
think.
So moving on to our final question, because I'm aware that I've kept you on here for almost 2 hours, so which is far beyond the planned 30 minutes. So my last question to you is, where is church for you right now?
I think church is where it's always been, which is with the people and the community, and that looks a bit different now. We're reaching each other in different ways, and actually I've had the opportunity to kind of reach out to like more people than I might otherwise do. But in a way, we're seeing now that the building is not the only thing, but I don't think it ever was the only thing.
I agree with this. I think church is, for me, it's always been in the fellowship of other believers. And even though we can't be physically close to each other right now, it doesn't mean that we can't be spiritually close or close over Zoom or phone calls or anything. And I think the other thing I would add is, like, for me, I'm finding this time quite helpful in terms of my own spiritual practices. So I'm finding more time and more need almost to pray and to read my Bible, which I haven't always been very good at. And I think that's been something that I've found quite helpful during this time, is kind of returning not only to, now that the kind of sense of community is either lost or changed in some aspect, I'm going back right down to the individual, and then hopefully once the time comes we can spread that out to the community.
Absolutely. Like, I'm not sure there's that much to add really, but just like churches wherever people are able to connect in innovative ways now. Like, it seems like quite boundaryless, which is liberating for me.
And I think church can also be in non-religious settings as well. So like if you're helping out a neighbour who has to isolate, I think that's church there, because you're showing the love of God to someone else.
Political Twitter threads.
Yeah.
I think there's something really holy in the kind of reciprocal relationships that we've seen develop, between neighbours and in communities, where people help each other out without really any expectation of kind of getting anything back. But I think as you give, so you receive from that kind of interaction and that process, don't you?
Definitely. I think Christianity is such a relational faith, and I think this COVID pandemic is forcing us to think of different ways of being relational that doesn't look like a physical building or a service at 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. with tea and coffee after.
I recently wrote an article about how COVID-19 almost acts like a microscope. It gives us this microscope for us to study with much greater magnification every single like institution and facet of society, and all of the inequalities that exist in our communities come under that microscope and have become more overt as a result of COVID-19. So yeah, I hope that we will take many learnings from it, whether that's to do with, ourselves personally and our spiritual selves, using the kind of silence of the pandemic and of the lockdown policies to, sounds a bit like cheesy, like, finding yourself or whatever. But, to just engage in some sort of self-reflection. And as you said, I think it was you that said this, Nuam, about even just picking up some of your favourite books, whether that's the Bible or something else, and spending a bit more time studying it and thinking, wow, I haven't stood still in maybe years. Yeah.
Definitely.
So God can also be in your dusty book collection on your manky shelf during lockdown. Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the something that happens in the Bible in the Old Testament is one of the prophets, Elijah, is feeling absolutely burnt out, depressed. He's at his lowest point. He wants to die, and then God appears to him not as some kind of miracle or some kind of like mighty force, but as like a gentle voice in the wind, and he sends an angel to provide bread and water and nourishes him physically and sustains him, and then he's just there in that kind of quiet stillness, which I find always like really, really beautiful and poetic. Like sometimes I think, especially in dire situations like this, we can have a tendency to ask God for like, give me a sign, where are you, what's this, why is it happening? But sometimes God's just there in like the quiet, bit like, hey, hi, and he's there in like the neighbor that you wave to, or person that you like text to check up on. And I think that's where we're having to look for God now, and God's always been there in the small things and in the big things as well. Definitely.
Yeah, I find, even though I'm agnostic and I don't subscribe to any kind of particular religion prescriptively, although I would say my beliefs have like aspects of Christianity and maybe also maybe Buddhism. I find God, if you like, in acts of joy and moments where like my ego, I'm not thinking about my ego and my ego disappears, and I'm genuinely in a moment thinking about like somebody else, without thinking about my own agenda. That's where I find what I would maybe label as God. Yeah. Wow, well done, everyone. Thank you so much for all of your really compelling contributions. Thank you, listeners. You have been listening to the Difficult Conversations podcast series. Today we've been discussing faith, God and COVID-19 with our really special theological guests, Victoria, Nuam and Liz. So please do keep an eye on their work, because I'm sure they will be stars in the near future in the field. So Victoria and Nuam, we really look forward to seeing your PhDs materialise. And Liz, thank you for the amazing work you do within your parish, and I hope that you also get an opportunity to return to PhD study or come to PhD study in your field. So thank you so much. I'm going to finish the recording there.